Good morning, and thank you for that. This is actually the first time I've spoken at a Success Summit following the keynotes where they take half your content. So hopefully I'll give you something useful today, and hopefully my slides can somewhat stand up a little bit. Just a little bit about myself. So when I joined Salesforce in 2003, we didn't have customer success managers. My first job at Salesforce was as a small business account manager, and it was the most interesting interview I was on because the hiring manager, who's still a good friend of mine, was actively telling me not to take the job, that I was too qualified. And not only did I see a lot of opportunity in Salesforce at the time, but I saw a lot of opportunity to help build something, and had good chance to do that along the way. I helped build our success manager organization for what we now call the commercial business unit, or our small medium business segment in North America. Helped launch the Toronto office in 2005, and then the main topic today helped set the foundation for our scaled engagement model and programs. So we talk a lot at Salesforce about innovation, and something we're very proud of in terms of product innovation, but we also had a lot of innovation on the success side of the house. I mentioned about 2003 is when we founded our customer success program team, and what you don't really see though is a lot of the acceleration in terms of our program and our scaled engagement model was really in the last 4 or 5 years. I have to give a plug for my colleague Mehmet here. The early warning system is something I'll touch on briefly, but he's providing a session on that tomorrow at 11 something, I think, which is good, and you should hear about that because it was really instrumental to a lot of what we've been able to do at Salesforce. I'm going to talk about a couple of things just high level to set context, and then I'll be going into a little bit more detail on some of the programs and the technology that we've used along the way. The first one we did, and you heard this repeatedly, was the focus on onboarding. And we learned early on, we were a growth company, we had the leaky bucket problem, and we said, well, why are customers leaving? And we found that a large percentage were not getting out of the gates properly. A lot of analysis, we showed that, especially in the small medium business segment, if they weren't at a certain usage level within 90 days, they essentially flatlined and attrited. And I'm sure that's true for many or most of you. And so our onboarding program in about 2004 was pretty basic. It was a series of 4 emails that went out, totally untailored, just time delivered, day 1, day 7, day 14, et cetera. But that's where we started. We ended up appending a phone call onto that, which was a bit of an orientation for our premier customers that helped them get permission for those services. But it's really evolved, and I'll talk a little bit more about it as we use the term journey now, where it's a really rich, interwoven program that includes email and webinars, videos, our community, as well as people when needed. In about 2008 is when we started to move to a scaled engagement model. You heard just the last speaker from Apogee talking about how the one-to-one walking the halls doesn't work at some point, and we hit that point. At that time, I had folks on my team that had their names on about 400 to 500 accounts in the system. They weren't managing those relationships. They had their names on the accounts, and they were working with a certain number of them. And so we really started to think about, well, how do we really work with those customers, the ones that need it, and help with that prioritization instead of having half a dozen people pick through 400 or 500 accounts. And that's when we started to pull people off of the front line and put them into more of a pooled engagement model and use data as our prioritization mechanism in terms of which customers and when to engage. And at the same time we did that, which again was about 2008-09, is we actually pulled other people off the line and started to build a dedicated programs team. And so folks that were not talking to the customers directly anymore, not part of that pool, but really focused on thinking about and building scaled engagement programs. I think this is probably bread and butter for most of the people in the room, just some of the foundational, at least from my perspective, the building blocks for what a success program entails. I'm just going to touch on them lightly, and there's a few comments I would make. Data is really around what we heard about, that usage data, right? What are customers using or not using from your product? It's also a source of measurement when we talk about systems of engagement, which is what are those technologies and or tools that you're using to engage your customers with. Content is one that I'll hit on a couple of times because I think we don't talk about it a lot, and it's really important and really painful if you don't do it right. One of the things that we learned is that content, best practice content, doesn't really have a home naturally. It's not tech documentation, it's not knowledge-based articles that are part of a curated managed support process. I still get pinged occasionally asking for a more recent updated version of a best practice document I wrote in 2007 that's still out there on our community somewhere. And I'm 5 job roles past when I wrote that document, and I have no incentive to go back and update it, but there are obviously people out there that are still looking for that knowledge. And so one of the things, and I'll mention it again, is just I think it's really important as you think about success programs and that content, especially best practice content, is where does it live? Who owns that? Who's responsible for maintaining it? Success measures is really tied to customer success in my mind, but that is what does good look like? For us at Salesforce, it's around product consumption. Are they using the features? Are they using the licenses that they've purchased? And then ultimately, are they growing their relationship with us? And so one of the things that we did early on is we looked at customers a year in, and we said, okay, well, these guys are using the product really well. And then we trailed back for a year and saw what their usage looked like at certain time intervals. And we said, okay, we think that's what good looks like. And we started to tailor our programs based off of that. We also looked at what does bad look like, and that's when we started to establish some of our intervention triggers for customers that looked like they were at risk. Jay talked a lot about feedback mechanism. We use both CSAT and NPS. I'm not going to talk a lot about those because I think he did a great job this morning talking about it. And then lastly, again, this was addressed too, so a lot of the content, right? But that definition of customer success, initially we would talk to customers and say, well, your login rate is low, or you're not using these features. And they would say, so what? I don't care about features or login rates. I care about the business value I should be getting from your tool. And so I think that helped us change our language a lot in terms of talking to customers about business value, not login rates and feature usage. So I don't know why we always use medical and military analogies in business, but they seem to work. I like this one because the one-on-one engagement model really teaches us and helps us build that knowledge base about what our customers need and what's going to help them. And so, similar to the doctor analogy, you used to go in, I have a rash, I have a cough, a fever. They would do some diagnosis, and they would give you a prescription or some form of remedy. And ultimately, over time, we've moved to this more self-service model where that prescription is now available for you to self-diagnose. And because WebMD, as an example, is a trusted destination, you can go there and say, my kid's sick and has these symptoms, and you can self-serve and go to the pharmacy and get your own prescription without going to the doctor. And I think there's 2 things that are interesting in this model. One is that trusted destination, which I think is a key part of building a success program. And the other, as I mentioned, is the curated content, right? That content has to be relevant and meaningful and helpful to people, or they're not going to go there. And then, no, I think I'll save that for the next one. Has anybody ever run out of gas? Okay, so I did one time on the Golden Gate Bridge at 11 o'clock at night. It was not the most pleasant experience of my life. I saw the gas light go on, and I refused to pay the exorbitant rates at that Velco station at the end of Lombard before you go across the bridge, and I ran out of gas on the bridge. It was a 2003 car, so it didn't say you have X miles until you run out of gas, or I may have made a different decision. And my point in that is really about, from a scaled engagement timing, is the timing of when you provide that information and the level of detail is critical, whether you're providing that internally or externally to your customers. And from a timing perspective, again, a lot covered already, except for the first one, I think. There's really, I think about a continuum of 3 different data drivers that can help you determine when you should engage with your customers at scale. The first is the simplest, which is simply time-based, right? They signed a contract, send them a welcome packet, send them a welcome email. It's 45 days prior to renewal, send them some sort of notice to get that process going. It's very simple. The second one, again, we talked about in terms of monthly active usage or whatever usage metrics you track, but it's more based off of how they're consuming your product or service. And then the third one is around customer feedback, NPS, CSAT. And I had arrows on here initially saying ease and then effectiveness as well, because the further you move from left to right, the more complicated it gets. You have to have that product data. It has to be accurate and timely if you're going to interact with customers around it. And while customer feedback is relatively easy to capture, enabling a program around it, a loyalty program, for example, is not easy. You have to get a high level of organizational support to do that, and you have to be in a position to act on that customer feedback within 48 hours, typically, of when they give it to you. And so for that reason, I put it at the end, because I think it's hard to really scale around customer feedback. Where I think you start to get maturity, though, and we started, as I mentioned, with onboarding, very simply, you signed a contract, you get a welcome email. We started to merge that with usage data. So you get a welcome email, and if at a certain point your usage looks like X, we send you in this direction. If it looks like Y, we send you in this direction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think left to right is sort of the maturity continuum as I think about it. And if you don't have anything in place today, or you're thinking about it, this is sort of the framework that I would offer. So I borrowed this slide from an internal programs team because I think it really does a nice job of depicting the systems of engagement that we use. So everything from the top of the funnel, starting with knowledge base and on those self-service vehicles through communities, and then at the bottom of the funnel is our most expensive resource, which is those one-on-one conversations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these elements with a couple of highlight slides, but happy to talk about what we're doing in these areas offline as well, because I'm not going to go into a lot of it. And the 12,000 per quarter, that's about how many customers we're onboarding now each month through these scaled engagement models. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our journey through these. So I think the most important thing about this slide is that it starts with an operational process. Who is that person that we're going to send this message to? And when we started this onboarding program, we got emails, we even localized them, we had some by version, and then we realized our delivery rate was horrible because we only had the sponsor and the billing contact as people that were identified in the system, not the person that's going to be responsible for setting up the system. And so we had to backwards engineer into the sales process, into a very mature sales process in a growth company, and get the sales team to agree to identify a main point of contact. That took months and a lot of politics to make happen. So that my first point and lesson learned here is really around the importance of that process step. There's a lot of technology that happens after that, but this starts with the key operational process. Who you're going to communicate with is probably more important than the rest, because if the message doesn't get to them, it doesn't really help. You can see some of what I talked about earlier about sort of how we branch logic. There's some time and usage-based drivers in here in terms of the data decisioning. And then ultimately, we put a phone call out to people if we're at a situation where none of our other tactics are working, and we determine that they're at risk. We have a pooled group that we place a phone call with. I meant to say earlier, a lot of the examples of what I'm talking about, we obviously leverage our own technology, and it's not intended to be a sales pitch on our technology, but I have a lot of peers that would be happy to talk to you about how we do that if you're interested. Email, I thought Alex did a nice job with his video, and used to work with Alex when he was at Salesforce as well as with Catherine, so it's kind of like a high school reunion sort of feeling a little bit here. Email is not the end-all, be-all in terms of a system of engagement, if you will, but it does really act nicely as a connective tissue for a program. And so it's relatively easy and low cost to operate. It gives you good data in terms of metrics, open rates. There's a lot of industry benchmarks that you can use to determine if your program or your message is working. And so for that reason, I still think it's a very valuable tool in a program. Success program, and I also agree very much with the point around how some of the roles in success organizations are changing, where you start to see email marketing as being a key component of the program, and we actually funded ahead specifically for email marketing at one point. I don't know if you can see the detail, but the point in this really is that the email is the vehicle, but the call to action is for the customer to join the community. It's to watch videos. It's to sign up for a webinar series. And then in some instances, there's an opportunity for, hey, I want somebody to call me. And we segment that based off of customer size as well as some of the level of service that they're entitled to. So our community serves a lot of purposes, again, built on our platform. Not all of them are customer success oriented, although you could argue that they are. Everything from event collaboration, customers helping each other. One I'm going to talk about specifically, which is in the middle, was what we call release readiness. And so this was our first foray into using community as a scaled engagement vehicle. And so one of the things that was really interesting and challenging is communities are by nature unstructured, right? Conversations spin up around topics that are relevant. People can self-form groups in the community. So trying to use the community construct as a structured vehicle to manage a program was an interesting challenge. But we decided to do that with what we call our release readiness program because there was a lot of content and it only happened 3 times a year. So 3 times a year, Salesforce releases new functionality. February, June, and October, and that's been our cadence pretty much forever. And in each release, we push out 100 new capabilities or more. And that's really hard for customers to keep up with. And so we were doing these one-on-one conversations. That didn't scale. We started doing webinars. That helped, but we weren't getting the feature uptake that we wanted. We said, well, let's put a community around that and see what happens. And very quickly, we had the largest and the most active community group within our broader community. What we did with it is we would push the documentation onto the sidebar, right? Here's the release notes, the new feature, sign up for the webinar here. And then during the webinar, we would use the community to facilitate Q&A and dialogue. And that kept the conversation going. Product managers would come into the community. It was a great way for them to be able to promote their features or address questions and issues from customers, and customers really loved having that dialogue with product managers. We also have the ability to pick off posts and transform them into cases if things start to blur between support and sort of best practice discussion. It took us 16 years to do this. There's a lot of companies that have done this long before than we did. I know Assistly, Alex's former company, they did this. They built in sort of that status bar. You know, here's the activities, great, you get a check mark. LinkedIn did it early on. You know, the profile status bar. We didn't do it early on. I wish we would have. I think it would have made life a little bit easier for some of us on this side of the house. But just in June of last year, we released a wizard, a setup wizard, within our product. It's in the setup area. If there is something that I could advocate that you do, depending on where you are, you might have a mature product and it's very hard to negotiate this if you're a growth company with a mature product. But this, I think, is really a key to success at scale because it eliminates a lot of the complexities. We have to extract usage data, transform it, find a place to re-engage that customer, whether it's email or in the community, et cetera. If you can engage them in the product that they're already in, the data lives in the product, I think it's a much shorter loop and you eliminate a lot of complications. Okay, so we have a funnel measurement approach for success as well. It starts very tactical and usage-based, right? So reach, engagement, and then impact. You can see the reach metrics are, in this instance, primarily just email, right? What % of the population are we hitting, open rates, click-throughs. And then you start to look at engagement. Okay, well, we got them the message. Did they do anything that we asked them to do as a call to action? So did they attend that webinar? Did they register for the community? We're starting to get to the maturity point where how active are they on the community? But that's a different level of metrics. And then ultimately, we heard about leading and lagging indicators, right? So usage and NPS can be viewed as sort of leading indicators, right? Are they doing well? How are they on that adoption curve that we think good looks like? And then ultimately, you know, the business impact one, did they renew? Are they growing their relationship with us? All right, bring it home slide. So, in 1 minute, all right. So I already talked about a lot of these, right? Build it into the product if you can. A lot of these scaled programs, if you're standing up a community, you're setting up an email marketing program, they take IT support and they take a fair amount of it. So I think it's really important that you enlist that support. We had for 1 year half of a dedicated Scrum team to help build out some of these programs internally, but that took a while to build that support. So that's a critical component. I think one of the areas that we struggled with was not getting good executive agreement on what success looked like for our onboarding program to begin with. And we were having conversations 2 years later around the impact of the onboarding program on renewal rate. I'm like, well, wait a minute. there are 12 months of other activities or non-activities that occur. I don't think we should be attributing the success of onboarding to renewal rates, too far down the road. But I think if we had done a better job of gaining agreement up front, we wouldn't have asked those questions for as long and frankly spent a lot of cycles trying to prove it. Prioritize customer onboarding, I think we talked about the importance of identifying that right person in the sales process. And then the last one, and this probably goes without saying, but we did a lot of test and learn. I think we had I had the benefit of being at the company when it was small to start, so we didn't have enterprise level company expectations. We could make a mistake. The emails didn't have to be marketing-esque quality. It gets harder now when you're a bigger company because people expect anything you put out to be enterprise quality. And so the rigor that we have to put around test and learn now is a little bit more, but I still think it's a really important part of it.